Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the April edition of Pearcey Conversations. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the Boonwurrung and Woi Wurrung Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and all our traditional custodians who belong to the lands where the Pearcey Foundation and you, who have, our guests, are based. We also acknowledge all their elders, past, present, and emerging, whose stories, traditions, and living culture in this country are a valuable resource, as are those of all who come to make Australia their home. Together, we are Australia. On behalf of the Pearcey Foundation, I would like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon as we discuss the past, present, and future of technology journalism in Australia with 4 of the leading figures in the industry over the past 40 years. A special thank you to our speakers for generously making their time available to share their views with us today, and my acknowledgement also to our distinguished Pearcey friends on the call. For those who don't know me, my name is Martin Ongle from Explore Communications. I've been involved with the Pearcey Foundation for a number of years as a volunteer on the National Committee, providing pro bono communications services for their many events and initiatives. It's my honour to welcome you all today. Before I hand you over to James to kick off today's conversation, I just wanted to make a couple of brief mentions. If you missed last month's illuminating conversation on Australia's sound engineering capabilities, you can now find and share the recording online. Thanks to the generous speakers, we heard about the pioneers, technology achievements, and the future of Australian sound. We'll share the link in the chat now if anyone wants to see that. We have some great conversations on the boil, and if you have any burning topics you would like to see discussed by industry experts in the future, we encourage you to email us at events@pearcey.org.au. So without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to founder and editorial director of Innovation Oz, James Riley, to get the conversation underway. James, over to you.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm pretty excited about the discussion we're about to get into. I'll be moderating, so I'm going to try and stay out of it as much as I can, but I think I have a little bit to say on this topic, so forgive me if I do jump in as well. We're talking about tech scribes, telling the stories of digital disruption. We're joined by Helen Meredith, longtime tech journalist, longtime editor of the Australian's enormous IT section back in the day, and went on to work for other newspapers. Beverly Head, also section editor at the Financial Review. I let these guys actually tell their own stories, but just on Beverly, I think on her LinkedIn it says freelance writer and contributor. Kind of a wonderfully understated position to give yourself, Bev, for someone who's been a legend in the game for a long time. Seamus Byrne, we're very interested, well, welcome Seamus, he will tell his story, but has just launched his own publishing business, Biteside, so we'll be interested to hear about that. Look, I was asked to set the scene somewhat, and it's kind of, it's a little bit strange. I sat and I've taken pages of notes. I'm not going to get through all of that. I don't want to bore anyone to death. I thought I would just very quickly frame where I came from. My first job in journalism was with an IT newspaper, I think you would call it, Computing Australia. It was 100 tabloid-sized pages, probably 60% advertising. It was the era of the rivers of gold. They weren't just in the Fairfax papers, they were also in trade magazines. All the advertising was for jobs. I've worked for newspapers and I've worked for trade magazines over the years. I guess how do I frame this? Okay, when I started, we were using Mac SEs. If you kicked a cable out, everyone who was working on that network lost whatever they were working on. So stories went down regularly. The companies we were reporting on, Wang Digital Equipment, Prime Computer, Hitachi, ICL, Sperry Burroughs, you know them all. About a week or so after I had joined computing, it got its first fax machine. And a trickle of press releases began to arrive via this crazy electronic communications device. We were getting literally press releases and hard copy photos in the mail with a stamp on it. So, I mean, it doesn't seem like that long ago, but you know, clearly it was. Computer Publications, which owned the which published Computing Australia, was a joint venture between Kerry Packer's Consolidated Press and Sean Howard, who would go on to great fame and fortune by founding Aussie Mail and making Malcolm Turnbull richer than he was at the time. Look, my entry into tech journalism was almost by accident, but I quickly came to find that as a horizontal industry, you could stretch a story across to cover pretty much anything you wanted to cover. So I was, you know, I've been fortunate to do some great things in journalism, and these guys will also tell some stories along those lines. I got to land on the deck of an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, having taken off from Kai Tak in Hong Kong, and enjoyed the catapult off the flight deck and back to Hong Kong that night. I saw a AsiaSat-1 commercial satellite get launched in Sichuan province on top of a Long March 3 rocket. Those were things that weren't really part of the beat, but I really wanted to do them so I could hassle my editors to say there was a technology angle involved. Look, over the years, my particular interest has been on industry development. That led to my latest role, which is as the editor of innovationoz.com. We write about the policies and the people that are making a difference to building an Australian industry. That's kind of captured my interest my whole way through. Okay. The role of the tech scribe has never been more important. We know this. The stakes have never been higher. The winner-take-all economics of platform tech, which has created giants, Apple, Facebook, Google, et cetera, the awesome power of algorithms and the impact that these algorithms have on the lives of people. This has made it a very important area, and we'll touch on some of those things. I think we've become very good at scratching the surface of tech. We have some great journos around, but it's very hard to get a mainstream conversation going about some of the things that are, you know, deeply important, very fast moving. I'm going to move over now. Oh, sorry, one other thing. You'd say all of this is happening against a backdrop of a fractured kind of tech industry in a geopolitical landscape that's becoming difficult for all players. So everyone's had their own journey here today, and they've got their own views on how tech scribes should be describing, you know, the universe around us. So I'm going to go to each of the panelists to start and just find out the motivations for getting into the role that they got into, and how they sort of chose to define the stories that they defined. Let's start with you, Helen Meredith. Helen, you. Right. There we go.
Hang on one. Okay. Oh gosh. Yes. Well, I'm the sort of the long tooth in this trio today. I was born in the Depression, and I came out of school in the early 50s, and I crashed out of University of Queensland pretty early, pregnant, became a single mother, and was still a single mother when I rejoined you in the 70s. 4 children. I was pretty poor money at the time, and I was science editing and also teaching part at the University of Canberra to students there, trying to teach them how to communicate. And I was also doing a lot of science editing on the side, a bit of a taste for what was going on, as you see it developing in Canberra, where there were already data, CSIRO, and a lot of other things happening in departments. It was also the time of the Razor Gang, and they were confusing CSIRO and a lot of other people, and sending TAA off to become wanted them to become go on the exchange. A lot of weird things happening. They eliminated 10,000 more public servants at the time, including data. got caught up in the crash. They were giving public service starter service at the time, and so starting to think I might write about some of these, and I don't know where. It seemed to me as if there was some potential there for something else on the side, which is what I was doing in money. National Capital Development Commission as their publications editor and stuck with them for about 7 years. And that was perhaps a very, very good training ground for me because there I had to work with the engineers, the town planners, social scientists, architects, everybody. And all the stuff that I was writing for them had to be tabled in Parliament. So I learned a lot of writing disciplines at the time and also learned a lot of interviewing techniques, I felt. Then I had a chance meeting with an interesting person who really became my mentor, I suppose. His name was Ernest Koskar, and he was Hungarian. He'd been a science journalist, and he'd been persecuted by both the Nazis and the Russians, and finally came out of Hungary in 1956 at the time of their revolution. And by the time I came at the Society of Autism meeting, he was blind, diabetic, very elderly, but he lost his spirit for science and technology. And he said to me, you know, looking for your next career move, you might think about the digital edition. It's going to require all.
We might have lost Helen there. We might have lost Helen there. So I'm going to again.
Have you lost me?
You're back.
Sorry, I'm going over to send my telexes on the Parliament House computer in the middle of the night now to Pacific Computer Weekly. And then I got a message from them saying, how about coming to work for us down in Sydney? So things were getting a bit hairy in Canberra at the time, and my last few stories had been rather weird, except I should just mention one thing here. It was when Bill Cayley, Professor Bill Cayley, had his company, his encryption company in Canberra, and he announced he was going to move to the Gold Coast. And I thought, oh, it's time to be moving there, by the look of it. And I think, gosh, there were a couple of companies whose name I can't remember now. Information Electronics was one of them down there making terminals. And they had pretty much gone upside down and were for sale. Things weren't going well. Make chips in Canberra, and they weren't going to anymore. I thought, okay, Control was doing pretty well for itself. Other companies into Canberra, but it seemed there might be more news somewhere else. So down to Sydney I went, and oh, one last thing, a quick anecdote here, if I've got time. I went. One of the last things I did before I left was go to a concert at the High Court, and it was given by this man called Dan, a composer, doing something very different. He had very first fairlights, computer music instruments, which had been developed through the School of Music, and he gave this crazy concert in the High Court, and just about blew his ears out. And he had this musician on trombone, Simon Khan, I remember, and this was sort of this fabulous concert. It was sort of a great farewell for me. I love music, and this was a great combination of what the future might hold in reporting for me and my great love music. And off I went to Sydney, was news editor on PCW, and then moved over to the Australian. And I'd like to say the rest is all history, but that was a colossally interesting time. And Beverly and I did many a field trip in those days, didn't we, Beverly? Do sometimes. And then I could tell you many anecdotes about this. We'll come back to some things that happened in that time. Different environment from working on a trade magazine, as Jane knows, working on a newspaper for technology. This is a very different thing. And we can describe some of that to you, I'm sure. But from the Oz, I moved to the gallery in Canberra when we were starting to have a very strong emphasis on communications, and the spectrum was being allocated there for mobile services. Very interesting period too. We were also seeing satellites being launched, rockets going up. I saw rockets launched in South America and in Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and sort of pretty much the height of my time on the Australian, so the Fin Review. While I was on the Fin Review, I went as communications editor after I was on the Australian for 10 years or so. I started also to be frustrated that there wasn't enough reporting on communications. I'd struggled with it on the Oz, and they hadn't really got the drift there very well. It was hard also on the Fin, I'd say. So I went underground, nearly got sacked from the Fin for doing it, and started Global Flow, which was the first international service focused on communications, which I ran underground for 6 years. Had one little discussion with the editor of the time of the Fin Review, who said, in your best interests to stop doing that. I should have sold it to them, but I didn't. And in fact, I kept that going until about 2000, something like that. It was about 6 years. Never made any money out of it. Got some advertising in the US, but not enough to really keep it going forever. So closed it down. But that's about the end of it for me. I freelanced a while after Fin. Had turned 65. Thought, oh, I think maybe I'll do the formal thing and retire. But they kept me on as a contributor for a few years. And I only stopped doing that because I ran into I caught a rare disease called Guillain-Barré, I think it's called some kind of syndrome with it, and went blind and paralyzed for a while, and spent about a year running around trying to think what life was about, and stopped writing. And that was about the end of it. I was sort of fallen out of the network by then, didn't have anything I could really concentrate on very successfully, and I've had a happy life ever since, living in a forest. So that's about it.
Well, Helen Meredith, I'm very glad you have found a happy life living in the forest. It sounds terrific. And your connection has been difficult, probably more so for some. But
I'm sorry about that. Yeah,
oh no, that's quite all right. We're getting some comments in the chat box saying your connection is providing commentary in real time on the NBN, and the fact that technology has not been on the front pages of the papers enough. We're going to go to Helen Meredith. Sorry, to Beverly Head now. Bev, what's your journey?
Hi, James, and everybody. Thanks very much. That was fantastic, Helen. So good to hear your stories, and yes, to have been part of those when we worked together on the Fin. Fantastic. The die was cast with me. I was actually born 50 years to the day after IBM was incorporated. So I was basically destined, which was also Bloomsday. So I was either going to wander the streets of Dublin drunk like Bloom, or I was going to get somehow involved in technology, and I became involved in technology. I studied the generation of journalists until probably people who are now in their 50s Most of us didn't study journalism at university. I studied metallurgy and the science of materials, and had that was my career plan. But I emerged into Thatcher's Britain and there weren't any jobs. So I became a technology journalist by accident, as many indeed did in those days. And I can carbon date myself exactly, because I started writing on a publication called Mini Computer News. And but I was using typewriters, so there you go. I worked for them for a while, and then for Computer Weekly in London, and then a bloke called Peter Scott, who many of you will remember, hired me over tea at the Dorchester and said, come out to Australia and write for us on Computer World Australia, which I did. And after a brief stint at Computer World, Alan Kohler asked me whether I'd be interested in taking up a position as the technology editor at the Financial Review. Well, you betcha I would. And it was a time when technology journalism was shifting slightly. Helen was certainly one of the people leading the charge on this. But when I moved over, Westpac had the CS90 program, $125 million program to build a banking platform for the future, what was then the future. And of course, over the next 6 years, it continued to unravel. And I was telling those stories and had the great good fortune to get on the front page of the Financial Review, to start to see those stories make it out of the technology ghetto at the back of the newspaper and into the front pages. But also to develop a wealth of experience to understand about those industries, to learn how to read a balance sheet and so forth, which was very useful. The 80s, of course, was also very interesting in terms of industry development, which James mentioned, because we had a very, a man who I still consider was one of the best ministers ever, John Button, and who was an absolute, he had enormous foresight. Now it turns out, with the benefit of hindsight, that some of the things that he did were actually counter to the World Trade Organization, and oops, we shouldn't have been doing that. But we had the Industry Partnership for Development and the Corporate Citizenship Plan, which I'm sure many of you would remember, which really started to build a groundswell in Australia of technology capability and so forth. A lot of the stories that we were writing were about the local technology industry, which was very nascent in those days and quite small. But mainly when we were writing about the technology industry, it was the overseas companies. And, it was I never got to see a rocket launched, but I did go onto a submarine, which was rather exciting. We went overseas at the expense of the technology companies. And looking back now, 30 years on, you think, gee, that, it smells a little bit. And yeah, it did smell a little bit. Did we write positive stories that we shouldn't have? Possibly sometimes we did. There was a lot of corporate largesse that simply wouldn't be tolerated today. And I think the rigor that has come into the industry is actually a very good thing. There were long lunches and, as I say, often questionable largesse. What I think the luxury that we had was time. In those early days at the Financial Review, I was running a weekly section. Now, it did become very big, not ever as big as Helen's section on the Australian was, to the chagrin of my editors. But, we would be running 24-page sections in the back of the paper and having stuff up the front of the paper. But we had a week. We had a week to plan. We had a week to rehearse our arguments, to go out and interview people, to do a bit of poking and prodding in those balance sheets. And I think, to the detriment of the quality of some stories, is that time has been stripped out of the equation, and people now are writing to rolling deadlines and to feed the continuous more that demands news. And I do feel that can be a big problem. I had some great opportunities to write some fantastic stories. In terms of possibly the one I'm most proud of, actually got me sued. Not successfully, I hasten to add, but we did get the Made in Australia legislation or regulations changed, because there was a company claiming to make in Australia. Well, no, it actually wasn't. And But then again, I was a very lucky young journalist who had the backing of the then Fairfax lawyers. And I wonder again, if young journalists starting out have that backing and are able to make some of the, quite meaty claims that you have to make sometimes. Alan Kohler was a great champion of technology stories. But then there was a little bit of a fallow period when we had to really hit our, hit heads to people to say, look, these are important stories. They need to be on the front pages of the newspaper. Companies like Aussie Mail started to appear, and I'm proud to say I still have my Aussie Mail internet address. It's a heritage listed email address. There weren't many women in the industry. There were a few of us, and Helen and I, along with Anne Moffat and a few others, set up organisations to try to support and get more women journalists and support women technologists. So it has changed dramatically. A great deal of progress has been absolutely excellent, and the caliber of young technology journalists is exceptional. But I do worry about some of the things that we may be throwing out in the bathwater. So that's really all I have to say as my introduction, James.
All right, thank you, Beverly. Very, very informative and entertaining as always. Now I'm going to give Seamus Byrne, who I don't know if I can call you youthful, Seamus, because we've all been in this game for a long time. You have written across national stories, and then obviously with multinational tech publishers. So you've taken a very global view, and now with your own firm, Bite Size. Oh, sorry, I meant to say industry and consumer stories in tech, and I think you'll have a very interesting take on this Tech Scribes discussion. So Seamus, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thanks, James. Look, yeah, I think it's funny. I do feel like the whippersnapper of the group with just 20 years under my belt. So, but I mean, my own career in the tech space started in the 90s. That's when I first hit university and actually moved into early era web development, as well as sort of video production and some of those areas. That's where I thought I was going to live, was in producing things. When my first year uni experience was getting online in 1993, getting access to Xmosaic on the Unix labs in computer science, and I just remember instantly thinking, this is the thing. This is what I want to do with my life. Something about this internet thing is going to be everything. Over that sort of decade, then just completed studies, worked in that space. And then actually I was in London thinking I was going to work in web dev when I got asked if I'd ever thought about journalism. Part of my studies was also as part of a new media technology degree, which didn't exist when I first started. But I kind of flunked out a bit of uni because I was having too much fun. And then eventually the degree I wanted to do appeared. I was asked if I thought about journalism. And so somehow I'd gone to London to get a job in the Fairfax office in London, working on MIS UK, just off Fleet Street there at the this tiny little shoebox Fairfax office at the time. Worked alongside Paul Smith, who was also a junior writer on MIS UK at the same time, who's now the tech editor at Australian Financial Review here in Australia. Through that little kind of window, had an amazing time, then came back to Australia, worked at, it's almost hilarious now, I worked at a magazine called internet.au, a magazine about the internet, and our publisher refused to let us have a website. And in some ways, that almost feels like part of the story of the following 2 decades, because there was this consistent push-pull from every publisher I ever worked for in terms of trying to work out, where does print technology coverage sit and how does it earn its keep alongside the disruption that we were reporting on. And as much as you felt like you wished you could give more advice to the higher ups to say, at some point we need to embrace this, it was always a battle, and everything always felt like it was a little bit later than it probably should have been to take most advantage of the things that were happening. After Internet AU closed, we had the magical experience of being made redundant an hour before our work Christmas party. That was a classic. I spent 7 years as a freelancer and worked across largely in print space, again, sort of for a long time there. That's where the freelance work was. There wasn't really digital publications at that stage in the local market that were commissioning work. Like maybe they'd put a couple of headcount onto the digital edition of something. But if you were earning your keep as a freelancer, that meant you were writing for print pages. So I wrote a lot for Fairfax, for news. The icon section of the Sydney Morning Herald for a long time was one of my regular slots. And then I learned that Chris Jans was about to open a company called Allure, and they were going to do local editions of some of the Gawker publications from the US. I actually sought out Chris to get the reins of Gizmodo Australia. I was a huge fan of what they were doing. And again, in that sort of flow of the disruption, I felt like it was the kind of outlet where they pulled back that kind of veil of the, the journalistic view from nowhere. And we would absolutely be advocates for the audience. And it was an absolute pleasure to launch that in the local market. I sort of became publisher of that group of titles in the following years across Lifehacker and Kotaku Australia, across sort of games and wider sort of nerd aspects of what was going on. But all through that kind of era, we kind of really did feel proud about, being hard on sleeve, talking about what is happening with Web 2.0, what's happening with the rise of smartphones, what's happening in the battle of which version of the NBN is going to be worth building. And it was that sense that we positioned ourselves as the voice of our audience, that we had expertise because we followed this stuff so closely all through that time, and that we loved it ourselves. And we wanted the best version of this stuff to win this real battle that was taking place in the world. From there, I moved to CNET and then became part of sort of the global CNET operation. We actually, through that time, merged into the single unified global CNET. And a big part of my fight there was to make sure that there was still a kind of local integrity to what was happening as part of that sort of global operation. And that was kind of a fascinating time. Also, just to be part of something that was, one of the absolute sort of, juggernauts of, I guess, digital publishing. Now that's been around for more than 25 years and, continues to do amazingly well. But yeah, at this point now I'm, running Biteside and in that startup sense, testing and pivoting in every direction possible across podcasts, newsletters, the website itself. One of the biggest things I've been trying to do is actually just create opportunities for young writers in this space to get paid to write about this stuff, because there's so few opportunities for young writers to actually get those first chances to not just be writing about it as a hobby, but starting to actually, understand what it means to be responsible to someone else for the copy that you submit and for the words that you're trying to say. Lots more I could go on about, but yeah, I'm sure we'll get into it as questions flow.
All right, thanks, Seamus. That was very fascinating. I love your description of the launch of Allure in Australia and that moment in time where tech journalism and the way we looked at stories really did change. It was an incredible period. Thank you for reminding me. Alan Smith is asking you a question. Where was that address of the Fairfax office? I'll let you answer that offline. Now, the question and answer is obviously open. If anyone is listening and wanted to put something to people here, I've got a couple to kick off. The first, Beverly touched on a little bit the role of skills and knowledge in tech journalism. Bev, maybe to you first. It has obviously changed over the years. In newspapers, there were cadetships. They didn't, tended to not have university degrees, and then you've had your experience with a degree in a technical subject. I've done a degree in in journalism, a non-technical and generalist area. And there are others who are, brilliant journalists these days who come from all sorts of different backgrounds. So, when we're taking on some of the complex issues today, particularly in areas like artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum, blah, blah, they're not straightforward. Where does that knowledge need to come from? What's important here?
I think the most important thing, James, is to know what you don't know, and to be prepared to go and ask the question until you're satisfied that you understand it. And that can be very, very difficult in certain areas. You know, quantum, I was once asked to write a piece in 400 words for a big bank that wanted a piece of a writing about it. What was quantum? I had 400 words. And you know, to be able to do that is very challenging. I'm not sure I got it right, but I think one of the key skills about being a halfway decent writer is to know the questions to ask and not be satisfied until you feel they've been answered. And you don't need a degree for that. You just need tenacity and to be out and willing to make a fool of yourself, really, until you feel confident.
Thanks, Bev. I wanted to, we'll move to Helen and Seamus now, and just kind of reflecting on that baseline that Beverly's put forward. I'm asking about like the role of an editor, the role of an editor in the mainstream press versus the role of an editor in either industry press or you know, a more narrow niche. And Helen, you touched on this when you talked about there are challenges inside an organization like a newspaper in getting your stories published. So to you and to Seamus, what's the role of the editor? How do you decide the stories? How do you decide the stories when there's such complexity?
It's a tricky one. That you're quite right. It's a very different situation on a newspaper. And I guess the really big problem for me when I was editing on the Australian was that I just had so many pages to fill, broadsheet pages, up to 40 at one stage, and they had to be all done with the knowledge that you were paired on a broadsheet with somebody from another section, and the timing on the release page for printing strain had to fit in with that. And we're talking about if you go back to the early 80s, we're talking about the fact that systems weren't working all that well together. And I mean, we were still using slide rules to lay out the pages. We were having those pages subbed by general desk sub-editors who didn't know the technology. And I had to be in a very special request to the paper to allow me to form a unit outside the main newsroom or within the newsroom, but basically really become an autonomous group and to have our own sub-editors. And somebody's answering me a question here. Oh, sorry. I'll have to answer this some other time. Excuse me, I just have to get that off the... Sorry. Excuse me just a moment, I have to screen.
Maybe Seamus,
yes, and basically what happened was that I managed to win that war, and we became this unit which worked incredibly long hours. We had to have most of the pages done by Friday night, ready for Tuesday, finish them off at weekend. By Monday night, we were hysterical. We the compositors who had the bromides to run pages. They were also best out of their minds, and I think they employed more compositors. They did find pages run, and I had to tick the pages. Well, the other issue we have to talk about here is demarcation issues, because during that period, the compositors could see their lives in sight on newspapers because pagination was going to happen. And so there was a nasty little sort of war going on. And they do quite strange things like accidentally dropping the bromides on the floor. And so you go to clear a page that you thought was ready to go, and suddenly heading missing or something mysterious would have happened. But you couldn't touch it, you couldn't bend it up. You had to just sort of look casually at the floor for some reason and nod your head a bit and hope they would actually get the page back together. But there were little things like that. But also, I should here, I guess, pay tribute to a team of journalists and editors who are absolutely brilliant Australian. They work really hard. Some are still milling around in the industry to this day. And the other thing that really helped me out at the time with all those was the presence of, I had a good enough budget because of the massive advertising coming into the Australian from all this, to employ stringers overseas. I had stringers in New York and in the Netherlands, in Europe and London, in South Africa on stage, and also could pay freelancers with Australia. So filing, people like Rothwell was filed in New York. And that huge wins. The other thing I had an opportunity to be in out of those sections, article magazines. So I had from the Economist and from the Sciences, a New York-based newspaper at the time. Absolutely brilliant work from both of them, and I was able to buy those pieces and from some other magazines as well. So we did have a copy coming in as well as relying on the staff within the newsroom. And so you have people like Roland Tilson and Margot Towie, who's with Bloomberg now, Heather McKenzie, working on magazine since. I could go on, and so many of them. And then the subs themselves, people, Rory Gibson went on to run the Fiji Times afterwards, edit the Fiji Times. Still, I think, we're Courier Mail now as a columnist. But they held us together, really. And they were beyond belief hard workers. Friday nights would come, people would want to go home. Roland always wanted to get the 6 o'clock ferry, and Angelica Jacob, Judy Friedlander needed to go to synagogue. And so we stripped down the staff on Friday nights. The other thing that happened during that period, I decided foolishly perhaps that we needed to have a tech market section. So we needed stocks to be after close of business on Friday when the market closed. But the systems didn't connect. So I went over to the stock exchange and had a yarn to them. They agreed to this. And what they agreed to do was to fax me the numbers, which meant they had to be keyed in. And so people used to run to hide on Friday night to get out of my, because nobody wanted to do this truly horrible job. And it was a serious job because in my back of my mind was my early days on the Australian, when I saw, I think it must have been the news editor, Alan Farrelly at the time, sack someone on the finance section for having a decimal point out of place. And which can, of course, bring a company down if you're not careful. So there were all these things which on a newspaper, as against a specialist magazine or a trade magazine, were a terrific constraint, really. And also the lack of appreciation by the news editor on the Australian, editor-in-chief, everybody, what we were actually doing and whether it really had anything to do with them, and whether we were worthy of a story up front, the front page of the newspaper, all those sorts of things. It was a constant battle. And Beverly knows all about that, the problem of the upfront story.
So I wonder. So you've described a very different world there, Helen Meredith, but it's one I do. I've got quite fond memories actually of that. But Seamus Byrne, bring us to a modern CNET newsroom or an Allure newsroom, and then and let's talk through like how those decisions get made in the particular markets that you've covered. I wonder if you can then also describe, like, it's never been cheaper to create your own publication. Maybe you can touch on that at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, yeah, it's a good point there. But through my time, I guess being an editor, I always felt like it was, what was our point of differentiation was kind of that critical question to ask, because I guess, in the early stages where you're just writing a magazine and it was monthly, then it's almost in the question of what is still going to be relevant a month from now, given print lead times and all those kinds of questions in the mag space, and trying to pick and choose that, what are the things that are still going to be worthy? And then sometimes what's the thing that we just have to have, like that if we have not included this, that people are going to wonder why we didn't include it. So there was always that kind of push and pull. Once heading into that, Gizmodo and then CNET sort of space, it was that, that daily cycle kind of meant it was then really about that sort of differentiation of, what's our version of that story? Why is this so critical? Are we, definitely at CNET, there was always that question of being fast, not first, was one of those kind of catchphrases of let's do a good version. We don't have to try to beat everybody else. That's not our purpose in life. Gizmodo had a lot more of that imperative to try to be first, but also sometimes to just go super long. I think there was always a classic there was that the first US written Gizmodo review of the original iPhone was 13,000 words. And that was something that they just kind of went, no one else is going to do this.
That's true.
And so, in that sort of space, there was a great example where I went to Melbourne for an Intellematics event when they were launching Sooner Traffic Channel, which was that early sort of technology to start putting traffic data over radio waves and be able to sort of help car navigation systems avoid traffic incidents and things before, every phone had navigation in it. I remember that the PRs were super focused on getting the attention of Drive, because Drive was going to do a double page spread in print. And then I just sort of went, I'm just going to looking at the different journos there. It was very car focused. So I just basically got one of the tech guys to nerd out with me about the technicalities of it, how it worked, what was going on, where they were getting this data. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a call from PR saying, so we've just learned the value of you bloggers because we just got a call from the German government asking if they can license the technology. And it was the kind of thing where it was just through that searchable online version of writing about these things, it was starting to change the shape of, what it meant for them to get media coverage. Now today, trying to kind of launch something. I mean, I'm lucky, obviously, with my web dev background, it means I've been able to build a bite-sized website by myself. But, that's essentially you just set up a server, which is, perfectly reasonably priced. You can now have CDN, which is, that sort of back in the old days, you set up a small website and you got yourself, what the old /dotting or any kind of virality, and your server would just explode. Now, for free, basically, you can have access to, content distribution networks that will load balance that stuff for you so that you don't even have to worry about those kinds of questions. And then, podcasting, newsletters, everything is kind of $10 or $15 a month to be able to do those kinds of things. The biggest question is just being able to invest in great writing, and as Bev was saying earlier, time, that those are the big questions of how do you produce the kinds of stories that genuinely cut through when everything feels like a race at times, or that you are essentially just one of a sea of options available through social media. As much as I can say to someone, go and subscribe to my, daily 5-minute podcast. I, tried to think maybe a very short form podcast is what people want. But again, if it's not just flowing through that standard river of information that they consume already, then it's really hard to even get their attention in the first place to encourage them to subscribe. So it's easy, but also harder than ever to get attention if you didn't already have a baseline of attention to work with.
I think that's a good way to describe it. It's easy, but it's really hard. So, and I'm impressed with your 5-minute podcast. You've got to try these things. So. There are inexpensive ways to market, and good on you for having the energy and foresight to get amongst it and have a go. Beverly Head, there's a question here from Wayne Fitzsimmons. What will it take to get IT on the front page going forward? I'm going to add a little commentary here, or some editorial on that. I think we've probably got more IT on the front pages than we've ever had. kind of forget things like all the Telstra and NBN. It's such background noise these days that, you know, communications is just this commodity, and we forget that that's actually our industry. Robo-debt, robo-programming more recently with NDIS, the encryption laws, even, you know, data sharing in government. These are all things that they get covered. They do get on the front page. They probably don't get covered in the same kind of, or in the kind of depth that I think they might deserve, but I'm biased. Bev, what do you think?
I agree with you, James. I think nowadays technology, technology stories, every story is a technology story, and the technology is embedded. If what Wayne's asking about is when will the technology companies get on the front page, well, it may be a Canva with, you know, its extraordinary valuation. It may be something that the Atlassian boys are doing. It may be, a reaction to a new minister, which we've had recently. So there are stories there, but I think increasingly technology coverage is embedded in the general fabric of every story. You know, and even this week, if you look at what the Prime Minister's been saying about social networks, it's even in politics now. But the sorts of stories that are getting onto the front page are different. But it's always there. And I would like to see a little bit more elevation of the deep thinking about the underlying technology rather than just the pattern of how it's being applied.
Look, I think that maps back to Seamus's point. You know, it's an interesting thing. The technology allows journalists to do a whole lot more than they could previously do. But in publishing, the expense is the time and the writing. The expense is, you know, being able to invest in a journalist's time to really come to grips with some of these bigger questions. Look, I'm a little bit conscious of time. We've got about 6 minutes to go. I've got these are pretty generic questions, but I wanted to ask each of you, what's the role for a tech journalist as we go forward? I mean, we've talked a little bit about the hot takes, the social media feeds that, like, everyone has access to a level of information that we previously just simply haven't had. So going forward, what's the role? Is it deeper niches? Is it fewer but larger organizations that have the resources? What do we think on this? Who would like to start?
I'll throw 5 cents in. Go ahead, Helen.
I was just going, well, one thing we haven't touched on, of course, very much in this, is also news now, as we know, with our problems with Google and Facebook, and is the role of government. And I think it's always been absolutely pivotal in the development of the industry, right from way when they didn't always do what they were supposed to do. And we relied on people like Barry Jones and John Button to try and haul us into line. We haven't since then, I don't think, had anybody in government who's really perceived the problem of the technology as it's developed. And I think now we need journalists to really keep a very close eye on it. And James, you know this because you're writing about innovation, you're watching the research and development issues. I go back to when Button was introducing tariffs. There's a really pivotal speech given by Barry Jones in 1982 at a conference in Hobart. And if anyone can find a copy of that and go back and have, I've got a copy of it. I had my old tape master recently of it. And it reminds us that if you read Keeper's Wake, you'll see why Barry Jones was capable of his finger on the issues at the time. And really, I would recommend anyone to go back and read, because it does remind you. And wiser people, even perhaps than he, have pointed out that politics is often at the heart of mistakes that are made with innovation, invention, creativity. And so we need the journalists now to keep an eye on government.
All right, we've got a couple of minutes left. Seamus, you're about to jump in.
Yeah, I noticed a question from Jordan Green kind of fits into this as well. And we're, talking about the separation of newsworthiness from just getting rich. And I think, this whole question of covering disruption and the fact that it is full of like promise and potential, but also pitfalls and problems there are so many. I always keep coming back to this idea that there is very little coverage of the cultural issues that are taking place here. And I mean that in a workplace sense, as well as, a society sense, in what these companies are doing and how it's impacting. As Helen said, there's politics wrapped up in that as well. All these questions right now over like the tenders to kind of re-engineering things that have already been engineered and just giving new companies money to do it all over again when there's already people who've been paid to do it just fine. Like there's so many things here where I feel like the business stories focus too much on just quarterly reports and, and who raised money, and less about the impacts of these companies and the way that it's changing things. There's a classic example where there was a whole Gamergate situation in video games like 6 years ago, probably even a little longer than that now. But there was a straight line from this weird little incident in that side of the industry that led to Donald Trump. And, Steve Bannon was involved in the very original aspects of this whole Gamergate situation. And at the time, there were all these debates over how important is it. But if people had spent more time looking at what is happening in this kind of simmering little culture online, in these weird little dark corners, that could burst forth into these other areas of what's happening. So I wish there was kind of more of that side of it from people who dig into it a little more.
Yeah. Okay. Look, we've literally got about 1 minute. Beverly, take that 1 minute. Run with it.
I will make of it what I can. I think Seamus and Helen have summed it up absolutely perfectly. But I would always go back to the one thing about journalism that struck me was what Clive James said. And I used to tell young journalists this: there's nothing to it. You've just got to get the right words in the right order. And as long as we all keep trying to do that, we're in the right direction.
All right. I think on that note, thank you very much to our panelists, Helen Meredith, Beverly Head, Seamus Byrne. I'm James Riley. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. It's been a privilege to talk about this with such an esteemed group. I'm going to hand you back now to Martin Orngel, who's going to formally close today's proceedings. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Beverly and Seamus. I think the irony is that we were talking about how much time we used to have. We've kind of fast ran out of time today. So in some ways, it'd be great to have another session where we could sort of dig a little deeper in some of the topics that we covered off. So I'd just like to thank everybody else for joining us today, for the questions we had, and we'll try and get to some of the questions offline as well if we can. So good afternoon, and I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you very much from Pearcey Foundation.